Inquisitor Heliana Vex stood at the threshold of the ancient, forgotten library, her boots clicking on the cold stone floor. The musty air filled her lungs as she entered the chamber, her mind focused and sharp as a blade. This was no ordinary mission. This was the kind of investigation that could unearth the deepest heresies known to mankind. And as always, Heliana was ready to purge the filth that might poison the Emperor's realm. She had been investigating rumors of heresy on the distant planet of Shirian 4 for weeks. Whispers spoke of a secret cult devoted to the worship of the dark gods, chaos, mutation, and madness. These were the enemies of humanity, and Heliana would stop at nothing to root them out and destroy them. The library before her was a relic from another age, one that predated the Imperium. Ancient texts lined the walls, their leather-bound spines weathered by time. The kind of knowledge within these walls was dangerous, touched by corruption, long before humanity had embraced the Emperor. Heliana's mission was clear: find any trace of forbidden knowledge and burn it. Erase it from existence. As she moved deeper into the library, Heliana's eyes scanned the shelves, her fingers lightly brushing the spines of the tomes. She had seen many dark things in her years as an Inquisitor, but something about this place felt different. A strange presence hung in the air, thick with foreboding. It wasn't just the weight of age or decay. It was as if the library itself held its breath, waiting. Then, amidst the shadows of the forgotten knowledge, she found it. A single tome, different from the others. Its dark, metallic cover gleamed unnaturally in the low light. Her hand shook as she reached out to take it. The moment her fingers made contact, a chill ran up her spine and a whisper filled her mind. You seek truth, but truth is a lie. Heliana recoiled, but the voice echoed in her mind, a whisper so faint it seemed to come from all directions. She opened the book, scanning the pages with a mixture of caution and curiosity. The symbols were strange, not of imperial origin, but there was something familiar about them. The text spoke of the gods of chaos, ancient beings of unimaginable power who had shaped the universe. It hinted at the possibility that the Emperor, the immortal protector of mankind, was not the divine being that the Imperium had always claimed him to be. It suggested that the Emperor was merely a man, a mortal who had deceived humanity for millennia. Heliana's breath quickened as she read on. The Emperor. That a man? The thought rattled her to her core. She had devoted her life to the Emperor's service, believing in his divinity without question. How could this be? Her mind began to unravel the very foundations of her faith, and doubt began to creep into her thoughts. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The Emperor is a lie. The truth lies in the warp. Embrace the power of chaos, and you will see the world as it truly is. The words burned into her mind, and she dropped the book, her hands trembling. Her heart raced as she backed away from the tome, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Could it be true? Could the Emperor truly be a fraud? Was the Imperium built on a foundation of lies? She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. Chaos was the enemy. The Imperium was humanity's salvation. But the more she thought about it, the more the seeds of doubt took root. Was the Emperor truly the protector he claimed to be? Or was he just another deceiver, hiding behind the facade of divinity? As she turned to leave the library, Heliana's vision blurred, and for a moment, the walls of the library seemed to distort and shift, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around her. She stumbled, clutching the side of a shelf for support. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more maddening. You can feel it, can't you? The power of the warp calling to you. Join us, and you will be free of the chains of the Imperium. Power beyond your wildest dreams awaits. Heliana's head snapped up, her eyes wide. The voice was not just in her mind anymore, it was in the air around her, tangible, like a presence. Who are you? She demanded, her voice barely a whisper, her hands trembling at her sides. I am Siench, the changer of ways. You have seen the truth, Inquisitor. You have felt the power. Embrace it, and you will shape the future of mankind. The name reverberated in her mind like a bell, and for the first time, Heliana Vex felt the cold grip of terror. Siench, the god of change, of mutation, and of secrets. She had heard of him, of course, but to hear his name spoken so personally, to feel his presence, this was beyond her comprehension. And yet, the truth was undeniable. The power of the warp was real. Chaos was real. Heliana stumbled backward, her thoughts spinning. She was a servant of the Emperor, sworn to uphold the Imperium. She had spent her life hunting heretics, rooting out corruption, and eliminating the forces of chaos. But now she was faced with a truth that threatened everything she had ever believed. Was she truly a servant of the Emperor, or had she been deceived? Was she really just a pawn in a game she couldn't see? The darkness around her seemed to grow deeper, and the air thickened with the weight of her thoughts. She felt the presence of Tsench growing stronger, pressing against her mind, offering her knowledge and power. The visions were overwhelming now, images of impossible possibilities, of futures twisted and reshaped by the power of chaos. She could see herself, standing at the head of an army, wielding power beyond comprehension. She could see the Imperium crumbling, its lies revealed for all to see, and she could see herself, not as a servant of the Emperor, but as a ruler of a new order, one shaped by the forces of the warp. Heliana's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of the decision before her. The path ahead was dark, treacherous, and filled with unknowns. But in her soul, a strange, exhilarating sense of freedom stirred. She could break free from the chains of her duty, from the lies of the Imperium. She could embrace the power of chaos, and in doing so, reshape the universe. The thought was intoxicating. For a moment, Heliana stood in silence, her mind wrestling with itself. She had always been the one to pass judgment on others, to root out heresy, to destroy those who had fallen to the forces of chaos. But now, she was faced with the most dangerous heresy of all, the heresy of her own mind. The Emperor had always told humanity that there was no greater truth than his own, that only through obedience to him could mankind survive the horrors of the galaxy. But now, Heliana had seen the truth of the warp. She had seen the true gods, the true power that could shape the universe. And for the first time, she began to wonder if the Emperor had lied. Heliana Vex stood in the middle of the forgotten library, her hand still trembling from the ancient tome she had just discovered. The oppressive silence of the room seemed to close in around her, the air heavy with the weight of centuries of forgotten knowledge. Her thoughts were a swirling maelstrom, torn between the life she had always known and the dark revelations she had uncovered. The whispers from Tsench, the changer of ways, still echoed in her mind, their sinister voice wrapping around her thoughts like tendrils of smoke. The temptation was undeniable. It gnawed at her, urging her to embrace the power of chaos, to see the universe for what it truly was, an ever-changing, mutable force, full of potential and infinite possibilities. Her faith, once unshakable, was now in tatters. The Emperor, the guiding light of humanity, the eternal protector, was he truly the divine being she had devoted her life to? Or was he, as the ancient texts suggested, just a man who had deceived the entire Imperium for centuries? The thought filled her with dread, but there was also a strange sense of exhilaration. What if the Emperor's teachings were a lie? What if the true path to humanity's salvation lay not in blind obedience, but in embracing the power of the warp? Her mind raced with these questions, and the whispers of Tsench became louder, more insistent. "You are ready, Heliana. You have seen the truth. The Imperium is a cage, a prison built on lies. Only through chaos can humanity evolve, can it truly be free." End of. Heliana clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she struggled to maintain control. The cold, metallic taste of doubt lingered on her tongue. The Emperor had taught her to see heretics as enemies, to root out corruption and destroy those who had fallen to the darkness. But now, she was the one who felt corrupted. Her mind was torn between the path of the Emperor's light and the seductive promise of chaos. The very foundation of her being had been shaken to its core. The room around her seemed to warp, the walls twisting and shifting as if the very fabric of reality was responding to her internal turmoil. Her vision blurred, and the air grew thick with the acrid scent of ozone. She felt the presence of Tsench, felt the power of the warp pulsating through her veins. It was as if the very energy of the universe was waiting for her to make her choice. "Do not resist, Heliana," the voice of Tsench whispered again, this time louder, more forceful. "You were chosen for this. You are destined to lead humanity into a new age, a new order. The old ways are broken. The Imperium is dying. Join me, and together we will reshape the universe." Heliana's breath came in ragged gasps as she fought to maintain her composure. She had always been strong, always unwavering in her faith. But now, she felt weak, vulnerable, as if the very essence of who she was being torn apart. Her hands shook, her mind clouded with confusion and fear. For a long moment, she stood frozen, caught between the two opposing forces, the Emperor's light, the duty she had sworn to uphold, and the dark, intoxicating allure of chaos. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her, suffocating her. There would be no turning back from this. Once she embraced the power of chaos, there would be no return to the life she had known. With trembling hands, she reached for the tome once more, her fingers grazing the cold metal cover. The book seemed to hum with energy, as if it were alive, as if it were calling to her. Her mind screamed in protest, but her body moved of its own accord, drawn to the dark knowledge contained within its pages. As she opened the book again, the text seemed to shift and change before her eyes, the symbols swirling and twisting like living creatures. The words flowed into her mind, their meaning clear now, as if they had always been meant for her. The Emperor was not the savior of humanity, but a false god, a figurehead who had deceived the masses. The true power lay in the warp, in the gods of chaos, beings of unimaginable might who could reshape the universe in their image. Heliana's heart raced as the truth washed over her. She had been blind, trapped in a lie. The Imperium, with its rigid doctrines and unwavering faith in the Emperor, was a prison. Chaos offered freedom, the freedom to embrace change, to become something greater than human. The warp was the true source of power, and it was calling to her, offering her a chance to transcend the limitations of her mortal form. Her hands shook as she closed the book, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. She could feel the eyes of the warp upon her, watching, waiting. There was no going back. She had made her choice. The whispers of Tsench echoed in her mind, soothing and comforting. "You have done well, Heliana. You are one of us now. Together, we will reshape the universe. The old order will fall, and a new dawn will rise." With a final resolute breath, Heliana Vex turned her back on the Emperor, on the Imperium, and on everything she had once believed. She had become something new, something powerful, a chaos sorceress, a servant of Tsench, a harbinger of change. Her path was now clear. The transformation was not immediate, but the change was undeniable. As Heliana Vex left the Forsaken Library, she could feel the weight of her new identity settling into her very bones. Every step she took seemed to reverberate with the unnatural power of chaos, as if the ground beneath her feet had already begun to shift, to warp, in response to her inner turmoil. Her thoughts were no longer solely her own. They were intertwined with something far older, far more potent. Tsench's whispers were now a constant presence in her mind, guiding her, encouraging her to embrace her new path. The fear and doubt that had once held her back were gone, replaced by a growing sense of purpose, of clarity. She had been chosen, she had seen the truth, and now she would lead the way for others to follow. The journey to the heart of chaos had already begun. Heliana's first act as a servant of Tsench was one of betrayal. She knew that the Inquisition would never accept her newfound faith. The old order would never understand the true power that lay in the warp. Her former colleagues, the Inquisitors, her teachers, and even her closest allies would all hunt her down, desperate to eliminate the heretic she had become. The mere thought of returning to the Imperium, of answering to the Emperor, filled her with disgust. The Emperor's truth was a lie, and she would not be part of it any longer. Instead, Heliana sought out the remnants of those who had already embraced the warp. She had read of them in the forbidden tomes, learned of their practices, cultists, witches, and sorcerers who had been cast aside by the Imperium. They were outcasts, much like her now, rejected by the very institution they had once served. It wasn't long before she found them. In a hidden chamber deep beneath the surface of Zirian IV, she met the first of her new allies, a group of rogue psykers who had long since abandoned the Emperor's light in favor of the dark power of the warp. They had been waiting for someone like her, someone with the strength and vision to lead them. They greeted her not with suspicion, but with reverence. She was the one they had been waiting for, the one who could guide them to true power. And in return, she offered them the knowledge she had gained from the forbidden texts. She would teach them to harness the raw energy of the warp, to reshape their bodies and minds, to become something more than human. The Imperium's doctrines of purity and obedience were outdated, and she would show them the way forward. But it was not just the psykers that Heliana sought out. She knew that to truly reshape the universe, she would need more than just a handful of followers. She would need an army. And so, she turned her attention to the war-torn worlds at the edges of the Imperium, where the forces of chaos had already begun to gain a foothold. She spoke to the tribes of mutants, to the corrupted soldiers who had once fought for the Emperor but now found themselves abandoned by the Imperium. They, too, had been cast aside, rejected by the very system they had once served. But in the eyes of chaos, they saw something different, an opportunity to become something greater, to embrace the power that the Imperium had denied them. In the eyes of Siench, Heliana saw endless possibilities. She would not simply overthrow the Imperium, she would transform it. She would reshape humanity into a force that could rival the power of the gods themselves. The warp was not a tool to be used, but a living entity to be embraced, and it would change them all. Heliana's power grew quickly. Her once strong psychic abilities, honed through years of training under the guidance of the Inquisition, became something far more dangerous. She could bend the fabric of reality to her will, twist the very air around her, summon the creatures of the warp with but a thought. And with each use of her power, she could feel the influence of Tsench growing stronger within her. Her once clear mind, so focused on heretic hunting and the destruction of chaos, was now clouded by visions of the future, visions of possibilities that stretched out before her like an endless maze. She saw empires rise and fall, civilizations thrive and crumble, all within the grasp of the warp. The possibilities were endless, and the more she saw, the more she was convinced that the Imperium's rigid, inflexible belief in the Emperor was a grave mistake. The Emperor's reign had been long, but it had created a stagnant, broken world. Humanity was shackled to the past, clinging to old beliefs, old ways of thinking. The warp, on the other hand, was limitless. It was the force that could reshape the universe, allowing humanity to break free from the confines of the Imperium's dogma. And yet, as much as Heliana was consumed by the power and allure of chaos, a part of her still fought against the truth she had discovered. She had once been an Inquisitor, a servant of the Emperor. She had once been convinced that the Imperium was the only true path for humanity. But now, she saw things differently. Every time she looked into the eyes of her new followers, every time she called upon the power of Tsench, the truth became clearer. The Emperor was a tyrant, a false god who had enslaved humanity for millennia. It was time for a new age, one in which the forces of chaos would guide humanity to its true potential. The visions came more frequently now, visions of the future, visions of the rise of a new order. Heliana saw herself standing at the head of a great army, a force that would tear down the walls of the Imperium and replace it with a new order. The Imperium was weak. The Imperium was outdated. Only chaos had the power to reshape the universe, to guide humanity into a new age of enlightenment. And yet, even as she reveled in her newfound power, a small part of her wondered, was she truly the one chosen to lead this revolution? Or was she simply a pawn in a much larger game, a game played by the gods of chaos? Heliana Vex had embraced the truth of chaos, but the weight of her choices was far heavier than she had anticipated. Her newfound power was intoxicating, and with every passing day, She felt herself becoming more and more entrenched in the dark paths of the warp. She no longer saw the Imperium as a bastion of humanity's salvation, but as a tyrannical prison built on lies. It was the power of chaos that had shown her the true path, an unending journey of change and evolution that transcended the stagnant, unyielding reign of the Emperor. But even as she wielded the power of the warp, a nagging voice at the back of her mind whispered questions she could not ignore. Was the price of her newfound power worth the cost? Was this transformation really freedom, or was it simply another form of servitude? Her once clear mind had become clouded with doubt, but she quickly shoved those thoughts aside. Doubt was a weapon, a tool of the Emperor and the forces of order. Chaos demanded unwavering faith in its power, and Heliana had made her choice. There was no turning back now. Heliana stood at the heart of her new fortress, a labyrinthine complex hidden deep within the desolate wastes of a forgotten world. Her followers, cultists, rogue psychers, and mutants had all pledged themselves to her cause, their loyalty rooted in the promise of power, immortality, and the chance to transcend their mortal forms. They followed her not out of fear, but out of worship. They saw her as a prophet, a harbinger of change, and together they were preparing for the moment when they would overthrow the Imperium and bring about the dawn of a new age. Her gaze drifted over the chamber, filled with the strange rituals of the Chaos worshippers. Symbols of Saench, the changer of ways, adorned the walls, twisting, ever-shifting patterns that seemed to come alive as she gazed at them. The warp pulsed through the air, filling the room with an energy that was at once exhilarating and terrifying. The power of chaos was everywhere. It coursed through her veins, flowed through the air, and even the walls themselves seemed to be infused with it. In the center of the room, a group of her followers stood in a circle, chanting an ancient incantation. Their voices rose in unison, building in intensity as the warp responded. Heliana could feel the power surging through them, growing stronger with every word. The ritual was almost complete. She stepped forward, her cloak billowing behind her, and raised her hand, halting the chant. The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. "It is time," she said, her voice cold and commanding. "The Imperium has had its time. Now, it is our turn." The room erupted into cheers as her followers hailed her as their leader, their savior. But even as they celebrated, Heliana could not ignore the lingering doubt in the back of her mind. What if they were wrong? What if the power of chaos, as intoxicating as it was, would ultimately consume them all? She shook the thought away. The power of chaos was limitless. It was the true path to ascension. To deny it would be to deny their very existence. But the whispers were growing louder. She could hear them even now, the voices of Saench, urging her to push further, to embrace more, to cast aside all reservations and doubts. They promised her power beyond comprehension, the ability to reshape the universe in her image. The old order would fall, and a new age of enlightenment would begin. But was it truly freedom, or was it simply a new form of control, a new prison disguised as liberation? Heliana clenched her fists, her knuckles white with the intensity of her thoughts. The battle was not just external, it was internal as well. She had chosen this path, but it was a path that demanded sacrifices, sacrifices that were not yet clear to her. In the days that followed, Heliana's power grew. Her control over the warp was becoming more refined, and she could sense the changes in the fabric of reality itself. The old world, the one she had once known, was crumbling, and in its place, something new was emerging, something powerful and terrifying. Heliana spent hours each day in her chambers, meditating on the teachings of Saench. She delved deeper into the forbidden knowledge she had uncovered, learning to harness the raw energy of the warp to reshape the world around her. Every use of her power left her feeling more connected to the warp, more in tune with the dark forces that surrounded her. But as her powers grew, so too did her awareness of the price of chaos. She had witnessed the corruption firsthand, how those who embraced the warp were changed, twisted into forms that no longer resembled their original selves. The more they drew on the power of the warp, the more they lost their humanity. Her once strong body, now a vessel for the energies of chaos, began to show signs of the transformation. Her skin was pale and marked with strange symbols that pulsed with dark energy. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her once beautiful features were beginning to warp, slowly becoming something otherworldly. She had known this would happen. The price of power was steep, and the deeper she plunged into the warp, the more she became something less than human. But the power was worth it. She would reshape the universe. She would become something greater than any mortal could ever imagine. But as she gazed into the mirror, she couldn't help but wonder, was this really what she wanted? Was this what the Emperor had feared all along? The warp was seductive, yes, but it was also corrupting. It promised freedom, but what did freedom truly mean when it came at the cost of your very soul? As the final preparations for her revolt against the Imperium were made, Heliana knew the time had come to face the consequences of her choices. The Imperium would never allow chaos to thrive. They would send their Inquisitors, their armies, their fleets, to crush her rebellion before it could even begin. But Heliana was no longer afraid. She had transcended the limitations of the Imperium, of the Emperor, and of humanity itself. She was a servant of chaos now, and with the power of the warp at her command, she would not be stopped. Her journey had only just begun. Heliana Vex stood at the precipice of the greatest war the galaxy had ever seen, the inevitability of conflict hanging in the air like a storm on the horizon. The forces of chaos were beginning to stir, gathering in the shadows of forgotten worlds, preparing to strike at the heart of the Imperium. Heliana, now a chaos sorceress, was more than a mere figurehead. She was the harbinger of the end of the old order. The once loyal Inquisitor, a guardian of faith and order, had become a rebel and a sorceress of the warp, determined to tear down the walls of the Imperium and cast it into the fires of change. Her army, once a ragtag collection of outcasts, heretics, and mutants, now stood united under the banner of chaos. They were more than willing to fight for her cause. They were willing to die, to be transformed, to become more than human. Each one had been touched by the power of the warp, their minds and bodies reshaped, their desires aligned with the will of Tzench. Their loyalty was absolute, for they had seen the truth Heliana had revealed to them. The Imperium was a lie, and only through chaos could humanity achieve true freedom. But Heliana knew that the Imperium would not let her rebellion go unchallenged. The Inquisition, her former allies, had already sensed the shift. They had already begun to send their agents to root out and destroy those who had fallen to chaos. She had expected this. It was why she had built her fortress in the heart of the warp, beyond the reach of the Emperor's light, in a place where the forces of chaos could fully manifest their power. Still, Heliana felt a tremor of uncertainty. She had long been a part of the Inquisition, once a tireless hunter of heresy. She had believed in the Emperor's justice, in the infallibility of the Imperium, and yet, now, she stood on the opposite side, a leader of rebellion, a chaos sorceress with powers that could destroy worlds. In some distant corner of her mind, a voice cried out, questioning her choices. Was this the right path? Was she truly the one to bring about the end of the Imperium? But every time those doubts crept in, she silenced them. She had seen the truth. The real truth. The Emperor had abandoned humanity to rot in the dark corners of the galaxy, and only through the embrace of the warp could they evolve into something greater. She had already chosen her side. There was no going back. The first battle came sooner than Heliana expected. It began with a whisper, a sudden surge of psychic power rippling through the warp as Inquisitor Caris, a member of the Ordo Hereticus, led a fleet to the system where Heliana's forces were gathering. Caris was no stranger to the ways of the warp. In fact, he had been one of the few Inquisitors who had long suspected that there were greater forces at work within the Imperium. But even he could not have prepared for what Heliana had become. The Imperium's forces arrived in a blaze of firepower, their ships cutting through the void like great beasts, each one bristling with weapons and shields designed to destroy anything that stood in their way. They were followed by a wave of space marines, Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's finest warriors, trained to hunt and exterminate those who had fallen to chaos. but they were no match for the twisted, sorcerous power that Heliana wielded. From the moment the battle began, it was clear that the Imperium's forces were outmatched. Heliana stood at the heart of her army, her presence bolstering the power of every warrior, every follower of chaos who had pledged their allegiance to her cause. The warp responded to her, bending to her will, and the skies above the battlefield twisted into nightmarish shapes, the air thick with the power of Tziench. Reality itself seemed to warp and bend as Heliana unleashed her full might. The first wave of Space Marines, the vanguard of the Imperium's forces, landed with devastating force, but as they surged forward, guns blazing, they were met with a wall of psychic energy. The ground trembled beneath them as the very air was charged with the power of chaos. Heliana's sorcerous magic struck like lightning, sending shockwaves through the ranks of the Marines, warping their very bodies and minds. Some fell, screaming, as their flesh and armor twisted into grotesque forms, their bodies torn apart by the raw power of the warp. The battle was brutal, but Heliana's forces were relentless. Her followers, many of whom had once been warriors of the Imperium themselves, fought with a ferocity that rivaled even the Astartes. They had been transformed not only by the warp, but by Heliana's vision. She had promised them power, and now they were fulfilling that promise. But it was not just brute strength that gave her the advantage. Heliana's mastery over the warp allowed her to manipulate the battlefield itself. She twisted reality, creating impossible landscapes, phasing between dimensions, and manipulating time itself. Her enemies found themselves trapped in illusions, facing threats that existed only in their minds. Those who did not die from the terror and confusion were picked off by the relentless onslaught of Heliana's acolytes. For hours, the battle raged on, each side locked in a brutal struggle. The Inquisitors of the Imperium threw everything they had into the fight, but it was clear that they were losing. They had underestimated the power of chaos, the strength that Heliana had brought to the table, and as the last of their forces began to retreat, Heliana felt something stirring inside her, the thrill of victory. This was only the beginning. She had known that the first battle would be hard, that it would test the strength of her resolve. But now, standing victorious, she could feel the full weight of her power. The Imperium was weakening. The false Emperor's reign was coming to an end. But even as she reveled in the victory, she knew that the war was far from over. This battle was just the beginning. The Imperium would not fall so easily, and there would be more resistance, more forces who would stand against her. But she was no longer the same Heliana Vex who had once been an Inquisitor. She had embraced the truth of chaos, and now she would use that power to crush all those who stood in her way. The battle had shown her one undeniable truth. She was no longer part of the old order. She was a force unto herself now, a servant of chaos who would reshape the universe in her image. And no one could stop her. The victory on the battlefield had been sweet, but Heliana knew that it was only a small step in the grand plan. Her victory had not only shattered the ranks of the Imperium, but had also sent a ripple of uncertainty throughout the galaxy. Whispers of her power, her transformation, and her allegiance to chaos began to spread like wildfire. The forces of the Imperium would not sit idly by, they would retaliate with all their might. In the aftermath of the battle, Heliana stood at the center of her newly expanded empire, gazing out across the wreckage of the once great Imperium. The planet on which the battle had been fought was a testament to her strength. The once pristine cities lay in ruins, reduced to rubble by the unrelenting forces of chaos. Her followers, once mere pawns in the eyes of the Emperor, were now rulers of their domain, their faith in Heliana unshakable. Yet, as Heliana surveyed the destruction, she felt a stirring inside her, a reminder that even victory had its price. The whispers of doubt that had begun when she first encountered the truth about the Emperor now grew louder. She had embraced chaos, but at what cost? Had she truly freed humanity, or had she merely exchanged one form of tyranny for another? The power of chaos was undeniable. It offered freedom, the promise of ascension, and the ability to transcend the physical limitations of human existence. But in return, It demanded complete loyalty, complete surrender. There was no room for doubt in the warp. To hesitate, to question, was to fall prey to the very forces she had once fought against. Heliana's transformation was far from complete. She could feel the power of Tsench coursing through her veins, reshaping her very being. Her body had begun to twist and warp, her once human features becoming increasingly alien as the warp altered her form. Her eyes glowed with an eerie light, and her skin, once smooth and flawless, now bore the scars of her passage through the warp. But this was nothing compared to the changes that had begun within her mind. She was no longer the Heliana Vex, who had once served the Emperor with unshakable devotion. That woman had died when she had discovered the truth of the warp, the truth of chaos. The woman who stood now was a force of nature, an instrument of Tsench's will. And yet, even as she embraced this new identity, she could not shake the feeling that she was losing something crucial to her very humanity. The daemon of Tsench, the voice that had first whispered in her mind, spoke to her once again. Its voice was like 1,000 whispers, echoing through the recesses of her soul. You are becoming what you were always meant to be, Heliana. You are no longer bound by the chains of the Imperium. You are free. Embrace your destiny, for it is the only path to salvation. She clenched her fists, the power of the warp crackling around her. She was free, but was she truly free? Or was she merely a puppet in the hands of the Chaos Gods? Heliana's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, a cultist who had once served the Imperium, but had since pledged himself to her cause. The cultist bowed low before her, his face twisted with awe and fear. "My lady," he said, his voice trembling, "the Imperium is moving against us. An entire fleet has been dispatched to destroy your forces. They are coming, with all their might." Heliana's eyes narrowed. The Imperium had finally gathered the strength to strike back. She had known this day would come, but it did little to dull the impact. She had struck the first blow, and now the Imperium would strike in kind. "You have done well to bring this news," Heliana said coldly. "But tell me, how long do we have before they arrive?" The cultist hesitated, then spoke in a hushed voice. "Less than a week, my lady. Their forces are vast, and they will stop at nothing to annihilate us." Heliana stood silently for a moment, contemplating the gravity of the situation. She had hoped that the Imperium would crumble under its own weight, but she had underestimated the depths of its resolve. Now, the fate of her rebellion hung in the balance. She had to act quickly. "We will not wait for them to come to us," she said, her voice laced with authority. "Prepare my army. We will take the fight to them. We will make them fear us." And the cultist nodded and hurried away, leaving Heliana alone with her thoughts. The preparations for war began immediately. Heliana knew that the coming battle would be one of life and death. She had already lost so much her faith in the Emperor, her humanity, and the very principles she had once sworn to protect. Now, she would risk losing everything for the cause of chaos. But even as she gathered her forces, she knew that victory would not come easily. The Imperium was vast, its power almost limitless. Even now, its fleet was gathering in the stars, ready to crush her rebellion with the might of the Emperor's wrath. And yet, in that moment, Heliana found a strange sense of peace. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. Her path was set. As the days passed, Heliana felt the tension in the air grow. Her followers, once uncertain in their devotion, were now resolute. They had seen what the Imperium was capable of. They had seen the lies, the corruption, and the hypocrisy. And now they were ready to stand with her, to fight for a new world, one where they could be free from the Emperor's oppressive rule. Heliana's powers had reached new heights. She could feel the warp bend to her will, its energies responding to her every command. She was no longer simply a leader, she was a force of nature. The power of Tsench flowed through her, shaping her into something greater than human. Her once human body had transformed into a vessel for the raw energy of chaos. She was a sorceress, a mistress of the warp, and her enemies would soon know the true meaning of fear. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a mysterious figure, one who had been watching her from the shadows for some time. It was a daemon of Tzeentch, its form a shifting mass of color and light, its presence both terrifying and awe-inspiring. "You have done well, Heliana," the daemon said, its voice a cacophony of whispers. "You have embraced your destiny. Now, it is time to fulfill your role in the great plan." Heliana stared at the daemon, her eyes glowing with power. "I know what must be done. The Imperium will fall and chaos will rise. This is the true order of the universe." The daemon nodded. "The time has come to face your enemies. You will lead your forces into battle, and the Imperium will be shattered. But remember this, Heliana. The path you have chosen is not without its cost. You will gain power beyond imagining, but it will consume you in the end." Heliana smirked, her eyes filled with an unshakable resolve. "Then I will embrace the cost. The Imperium must fall, and I will be the one to bring it down." As the daemon vanished into the warp, Heliana prepared for the final confrontation. She knew that this battle would be unlike any other. She was not just fighting for survival, she was fighting for the future of humanity itself. The power of chaos was hers, and with it, she would shape the galaxy in her image. The Imperium had no idea what was coming. The final days before the battle were filled with tension, but also with anticipation. Heliana Vex, now fully embraced by the powers of chaos, had become a force unlike any other in the galaxy. The witch hunts of the Imperium, which had once been her domain, now seemed distant and irrelevant. The power of Tzeentch coursed through her veins, transforming her both physically and mentally into something beyond human. She had become the instrument of chaos, an agent of change, and the future of the galaxy now lay in her hands. Her fortress in the heart of the warp, once a mere refuge, now became a seat of power. Here, Heliana was free to weave her sorcerous magics, to manipulate the very fabric of reality itself. Her followers, now fanatical in their devotion, obeyed her every command. They were no longer just rebels or heretics. They were the new order, the champions of chaos, standing in opposition to the old, broken Imperium. Heliana's mind was a labyrinth of conflicting thoughts. She had seen the truth. The Emperor was a lie. The Imperium was a tyrannical regime that stifled growth and evolution. She had rejected the idea of a god-king who demanded worship in the name of stability. The warp, on the other hand, offered freedom, creativity, and limitless potential. With the power of Tzeentch, Heliana saw the universe as it could be, a place where humans could evolve and transcend their physical forms, a place where the warp was no longer a dark force to be feared, but a transformative tool to create a new order. Yet, despite the power she had gained, a small, nagging voice inside her still questioned everything. Was she really better than the Imperium? Was she, in her quest to tear down the old order, simply creating a new one that would be just as oppressive? The whispers of Tzeentch echoed in her mind, but Heliana could not silence her doubts completely. She knew that in the end, the warp did not care for the morality of her choices. It cared only for the change itself, the evolution of chaos. The day of the final confrontation arrived. The fleet of the Imperium, under the command of Inquisitor Caris, was already approaching the planet where Heliana had taken refuge. It was a vast armada, composed of mighty warships, accompanied by legions of space marines and Adeptus Mechanicus war machines. They had come to destroy her, to eliminate the threat she posed to their way of life. But they had no idea of the true power Heliana now wielded. As the forces of the Imperium descended into the atmosphere, Heliana stood before her followers, her hands raised to the sky. The warp trembled with anticipation, swirling around her, whispering promises of unimaginable power. The air crackled with energy, the ground beneath them pulsing with the raw force of the chaos that surged within her. She was no longer simply a leader. She had become the manifestation of chaos itself. "I have seen the future, my children," she said, her voice a mixture of command and reverence. "The Imperium will fall today. The lies they have spread will be destroyed. The Emperor's throne will crumble, and humanity will embrace the warp, embracing evolution and change as they were always meant to. We are the future, and we will reshape this galaxy." The gathered forces cheered, their voices rising in a cacophony of madness and devotion. The time had come. Heliana had long since abandoned her old life as an Inquisitor. She had once hunted chaos. Now, she was the very thing she had once despised. But in her heart, she believed it was for the greater good. She believed that the warp was the only true path forward, and that humanity would only thrive once it embraced its power. The battle began in a burst of fire. The Imperium's fleet unleashed its fury, bombing the surface of the planet with a relentless barrage of missiles and artillery. Space Marines dropped from the skies, their power armor gleaming with the sigils of the Emperor. They were unstoppable, an army forged from the purest warriors in the galaxy. But Heliana's forces, empowered by the warp, were ready. She raised her hands, and reality itself bent to her will. The ground trembled as a massive psychic barrier enveloped her forces, protecting them from the incoming bombardment. The air was thick with the warp, and the Imperium's weapons struggled to pierce it. The Space Marines, undeterred, pressed forward, but they were met with an onslaught of psychic energy that sent their ranks into disarray. Heliana's power was too great, and the forces of chaos were far more numerous than the Imperium had anticipated. Heliana herself joined the battle, her form cloaked in shifting, ethereal light. She appeared as both human and something else entirely, her body twisting with the energy of the warp. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, her hands crackling with energy. She unleashed devastating waves of psychic power, ripping through the ranks of the Space Marines, sending them flying through the air as their bodies were torn apart by her raw might. But as the battle raged on, a new figure emerged from the Imperium's forces, Inquisitor Karis, the one who had once been her comrade in arms. He was a master of the psychic arts himself, and he had come prepared to face the threat she posed. He was not just an ordinary Inquisitor, he was a living weapon, a champion of the Emperor, a man who had witnessed the horrors of the warp firsthand and had dedicated his life to eradicating it. The two locked eyes across the battlefield, and for a brief moment, Heliana saw a flicker of the woman she had once been. Karis had been her mentor, her ally, and her friend. But now, he was her enemy, and their ideals could never coexist. Heliana's heart twisted with a strange mixture of grief and rage. She had been forced to betray everything she had once stood for. And now, Karis was the one who would try to stop her. The air between them crackled with psychic energy. Karis advanced, his psychic powers surging as he created a wall of flame to block Heliana's path. But Heliana simply laughed, a sound that was both twisted and beautiful. "You don't understand, Karis. This is the future. The Emperor's reign is over. You cannot stop what has already begun." Karis's expression hardened, his eyes burning with hatred. "You've fallen, Heliana. You've embraced the lies of chaos. You are no longer the woman I once knew." Heliana's laughter faded, replaced by a cold, pitiless smile. "The woman you knew is dead, Karis, and in her place stands something greater." End 40. With a final surge of psychic energy, the two clashed in an explosion of light and power. The ground trembled beneath them, the forces of chaos and the Imperium locked in a desperate struggle for control. The fate of the galaxy was on the line, and only one side would emerge victorious. The air was thick with the crackling energy of war. The battlefield, once a quiet and peaceful world, had now become a war-torn hellscape. The forces of chaos, led by Heliana Vex, were locked in a brutal clash with the Imperium's finest warriors. Above them, the Imperium's ships loomed, bombarding the surface with missiles and cannon fire, their engines roaring like thunder. But it was the ground battle that was truly decisive, the final confrontation between the forces of order and the forces of chaos. Heliana stood at the heart of the conflict, her body now a terrifying manifestation of Tzeentch's power. Her form was ever-changing, constantly shifting between reality and the warp, her flesh intertwined with the arcane energy of the gods. Her once pristine Inquisitor armor had been replaced by the dark robes of a sorceress, adorned with the symbols of her new allegiance. Her eyes glowed with an unholy light, and the air around her hummed with the essence of forbidden knowledge. Opposite her stood Inquisitor Karis, his expression one of unwavering determination. The man who had once been her mentor now stood as her greatest foe. He was clad in the full regalia of the Emperor's Inquisition, his power armor etched with the sigils of the Imperium. His psychic powers were formidable, his mind focused on one singular task: to end the chaos that Heliana had embraced and to restore order to the galaxy. The two exchanged glares, their psychic energies crackling like lightning. Heliana had no love for Karis anymore. He was a symbol of everything she had rejected: the rigid, oppressive structure of the Imperium, the lies of the Emperor, and the suffocating grip of the ecclesiarchy. Karis, on the other hand, had once seen in Heliana the best of the Imperium, but now he saw only a corrupted soul, lost to the temptations of chaos. "You were once the Emperor's most loyal servant, Heliana," Karis said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "What happened to you? Why did you betray everything we fought for?" Heliana's lips curled into a cruel smile. "I haven't betrayed anything, Karis. I've seen the truth. The Emperor is not the god he claims to be. The Imperium is a prison, and humanity is shackled by it. I am the key to breaking those chains. Through the warp, through chaos, humanity will evolve. We will be free." Karis shook his head, his expression grim. "You've been deceived. Chaos only brings destruction, madness. It's the same as the Emperor's lies. The warp feeds on that which is weak and corrupted. You cannot truly believe this is the path to salvation." Heliana's eyes flared with an unholy fire. "I see things you cannot comprehend. You are too blind, too loyal to a dying cause. The Imperium is falling apart, and only chaos can offer true salvation. I've felt the power of Tsiench coursing through me. I've seen the future, Karis, and it is chaos." Then, with a wave of her hand, the air around them distorted, and the ground trembled. The warp surged violently, and tendrils of energy lashed out, striking down the space marines who dared to approach. The ground erupted in flashes of blinding light as the battle raged on, but all around them, time seemed to slow, as if the very fabric of reality was bending to their wills. Karis raised his hand, summoning the Emperor's will, and a wave of psychic energy surged from his body, pushing back the encroaching tendrils of chaos. The two combatants stood in the eye of the storm, their battle shifting between the material and immaterial worlds. Every strike they exchanged sent shockwaves through the very fabric of the universe, distorting reality and creating rifts in the warp itself. Heliana's mind was ablaze with visions of the future. She saw the Imperium burning, its foundation crumbling, and humanity breaking free from the shackles of the Emperor's tyranny. She saw a world where the warp was no longer feared, where mankind embraced the power of chaos and evolved beyond their mortal limitations. She could feel the power of Tsench growing within her, feeding on her conviction and strengthening her resolve. But even as her power surged, she could feel the weight of Karis's words pressing on her. Was she truly on the right path? Was chaos the true way forward? Was she simply a pawn in the hands of the dark gods, manipulated by the whispers of Tsench? "Do you hear it, Heliana?" Karis called out, his voice echoing in her mind. "The truth is not in the warp. The truth is in the light of the Emperor. He is the only true path. Your power, your strength, they are hollow. You've traded your soul for a lie." Heliana's heart twisted as Karis's words struck home, but she quickly suppressed the doubt. She had made her choice. There was no going back. The Imperium was broken, and chaos was the future. She would lead the charge into a new age, an age where the warp was the foundation of all creation. With a roar of defiance, Heliana summoned the full might of Tsiench, her body writhing with arcane energy. Reality bent and shattered around her as she unleashed a torrent of psychic power toward Karis. The energy tore through the air, twisting the fabric of time and space itself. Karis raised his hands, summoning his own psychic defenses, but the force of Heliana's attack was overwhelming. The two forces collided with a deafening explosion of light, shaking the very foundation of the planet. For a moment, the battlefield was silent. Then, slowly, the dust began to settle and the air cleared. Heliana stood tall, her form radiant with the energy of the warp. Karis, however, lay broken on the ground, his power armor shattered, his psychic defenses shattered. The Inquisitor was defeated, but the victory came at a cost. Heliana could feel the warp's influence pulling at her, threatening to consume her completely. She could feel her humanity slipping away, replaced by the cold, unfeeling embrace of chaos. The transformation was complete, but it was not without sacrifice. Heliana had won, but at what cost? She had become a vessel for the power of chaos, a sorceress in the service of the dark gods. She had destroyed the man she once called her mentor, and in doing so, had irrevocably severed her ties to the Imperium and everything she had once believed in. But in the end, it did not matter. She was now the one in control. She had taken the first step toward the future of humanity, one that would be shaped by the power of the warp. The battle had ended, but the true war was only just beginning. Heliana stood victorious over the wreckage of the battle, the forces of the Imperium scattered or broken, their leaders crushed beneath her power. The planet, once a peaceful world caught in the turmoil of a long war, was now a battlefield for the ultimate conflict, one between the old order of the Imperium and the new, chaotic future that Heliana had forged. Her transformation was now complete. She had fully embraced the power of Tziench, becoming more than just a mere mortal. Her mind was a labyrinth of ancient knowledge, her body reshaped and infused with the energies of the warp. She could feel it coursing through her veins, giving her strength, power, and purpose. The once proud Inquisitor had become something more, something feared, something powerful. Standing at the edge of the wreckage, Heliana looked out over the battlefield, her eyes burning with an intensity that could have set the very stars ablaze. The Imperium had fallen, but the war was not yet over. There were still enemies to face, still challenges to overcome, and she knew that her work had only just begun. Her first act as the new leader of chaos was to turn her gaze to the stars. She could see them now vast and endless, a canvas on which she would paint a new future. She had seen the visions that Tziench had given her, a future where the warp was no longer feared, where humanity had embraced change and transformation, where the shackles of the Emperor's lies had been shattered. But to bring this vision to fruition, she would need more than just her own strength. She needed followers, those who would walk the path of chaos with her, who would cast aside their old beliefs and join her in the revolution. She would need to gather an army, one that would rise up against the remaining forces of the Imperium, an army that would sweep through the galaxy and bring about the dawn of a new age. And so, Heliana began to form her cult, an army of zealots, sorcerers, and renegades, all drawn to her cause. Some were former Inquisitors, men and women who had once hunted the forces of chaos, but had now seen the truth of her teachings. Others were ordinary citizens, warriors from the outer reaches of the Imperium, who had come to understand the power of the warp and the possibilities it offered. All were united under her banner, willing to do whatever it took to reshape the galaxy. As the months passed, Heliana's power grew. She began to develop new, terrifying sorceries, weaving the energies of the warp into spells of unimaginable destruction. Her followers became stronger, more devoted, and more numerous. The Imperium had no idea what was coming for them. The forces of chaos were united, and they were ready to strike. Yet, despite the power she had gained, Heliana still struggled with the remnants of her past. The memories of her former life as an Inquisitor, her duty, her loyalty to the Emperor, the sacrifices she had made haunted her. Every now and then, she would hear Karis's voice in her mind, reminding her of the path she had chosen and the person she had become. She could still feel the weight of his betrayal, the guilt of having killed him, even as she tried to justify her actions. But with each passing day, those feelings became more distant. They were the vestiges of a life she had long since abandoned. She was no longer Heliana Vex, the loyal servant of the Emperor. She was now a servant of the warp, and that was her only truth. The first campaign to reshape the galaxy began in the Outer Rim, a series of planets that had long been neglected by the Imperium. Heliana's forces descended upon the planet of Ralthar, a world rich in resources and strategically important to the Imperium. The planet had been a target for chaos forces for centuries, but it had always been under the protection of the Imperial Guard and Space Marines. However, this time, there was no force that could stand against her. She led the assault herself, her sorceress powers tearing through the Imperial defenses with ease. The battle was swift and brutal, and within days, Raltha was taken. The Imperium's forces, once proud and unyielding, were scattered and defeated. The people of the planet, having seen the true power of chaos, were eager to join her cause, swelling her ranks with new followers. But even in the midst of her victory, Heliana could feel the forces of chaos whispering in her ear, urging her to go further, to take more. She had promised herself that this was the beginning of the end for the Imperium, but now that the first blow had been struck, she wanted more. She was addicted to the power, to the sense of control that the warp gave her. The temptation to embrace even darker forces tugged at her heart, and she knew she could not resist for long. With Ralthar secured, Heliana turned her attention to the next planet on her list, Vexillon, a stronghold of the Imperium. It was a bastion of order and discipline, home to some of the finest soldiers in the Imperium. But Heliana knew that even the greatest walls could be broken with the right force, and she had that force. Her forces gathered, and once again, she led the charge. This time, however, she did not merely rely on her powers. She had learned to manipulate the minds of her enemies, using her sorcery to sow discord and fear among the Imperium's ranks. She twisted their thoughts, turned their own soldiers against them, and caused their unity to collapse from within. The Imperium's forces were thrown into disarray, and Vexillon fell to her forces within weeks. The world of Vexillon lay in ruins. The Imperium's once proud bastion had crumbled beneath the onslaught of Heliana's forces, now loyal to her vision of the future, a vision shaped by the power of chaos. The flames of war still smoldered across the shattered cities, and the last remnants of the Imperium's soldiers fled into the wilderness, broken and scattered. Heliana stood amidst the wreckage, her heart burning with triumph, but also with an unsettling emptiness. She had done what she set out to do. Her revolution had begun. But now, the question remained, what would she do with all this power? The whispers of the warp grew louder with every victory, and Heliana could feel the pull of Siench, the great architect of fate. The god's power was intoxicating, and Heliana's transformation into a chaos sorceress had only just begun. The more she embraced the warp, the stronger she became, but the more she feared what it would cost her. She had already lost so much of her humanity, but what lay beyond the threshold? Would she truly become one with the warp, losing herself completely in the pursuit of ultimate power? Or would she find the strength to maintain her individuality in the face of such overwhelming forces? As she stood over the ruins of Vexillon, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a tall, cloaked man, his face hidden beneath the hood of his robes. His presence radiated an unsettling calm, and he carried himself with the authority of one who had seen the rise and fall of empires. "Heliana Vex," the figure said, his voice smooth but commanding. "You have done what many believed impossible. You have brought chaos to the very heart of the Imperium." Heliana turned to face him, her eyes glowing with an inner fire. "Who are you?" "I am Magister Zephyron," the man replied, stepping forward. "I have been watching your progress, Inquisitor. You have the potential to reshape this galaxy, to bring forth the reign of the dark gods, but your journey is far from over. The Imperium may be in disarray, but there are still forces within the warp and outside it that seek to stop you." Heliana narrowed her eyes, sensing the underlying message in his words. "What are you offering, Zephyron?" "I offer you knowledge," Zephyron said, a dark smile crossing his lips. "The true power of chaos, the path to even greater strength. But you must make a choice, Heliana. There is a price for everything. The warp does not give without taking." Heliana hesitated, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. She had already given so much, already sacrificed so much. But the allure of greater power, of becoming something more than human, was hard to resist. Yet, she could not ignore the faint sense of doubt that lingered in her mind. "What price?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Zephyron stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with an unholy light. "The price is your soul, Heliana. You must surrender the last remnants of your humanity. if you wish to unlock the full potential of the warp. You will become a true servant of chaos, a being of unimaginable power, but you will lose yourself in the process. Heliana looked down at her hands, still trembling from the psychic energy that flowed through her. She had already sacrificed so much of herself in the name of chaos, and the thought of giving up her soul, her very essence, seemed terrifying. But at the same time, she could feel the power coursing through her veins, the urge to dominate and reshape the universe growing stronger with every passing moment. She turned her gaze back to Zephyron, her decision beginning to form in her mind. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "If you refuse," Zephyron said, "you will remain a pawn. The Imperium will regroup, and the forces of chaos will never rise to the level they could. You will never achieve the true power you seek, and your enemies will hunt you down. Your revolution will falter." Heliana clenched her fists, feeling the weight of his words. It was true, there could be no turning back now. She had already chosen her path, and there was no place for hesitation. She had already killed her former mentor, severed her ties to the Imperium, and embraced the power of chaos. The only way forward was through the warp. "I will do it," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "I will sacrifice everything to bring about the new age. I will be the one to lead humanity into the embrace of the warp." Zephyron nodded, his smile widening. "Then, welcome to your true destiny, Heliana Vex. You are the one who will bring about the end of the Imperium and the beginning of a new era. The power of the dark gods is yours to command." With those words, Heliana stepped forward, her mind fully embracing the power of chaos. The warp surged around her, and for a brief moment, she felt the entire galaxy bend to her will. She could see the future unfold before her, a future where humanity was no longer shackled by the lies of the Emperor, a future where the power of chaos was not feared, but worshipped. As she stood in the ruins of Vexillon, she knew that the Imperium would never rise again. The galaxy would be hers to reshape, and she would lead humanity into a new era. The journey would be long, and the path would be fraught with dangers, but she was ready. She was chaos incarnate, and nothing would stop her.